we're talking about here is when you don't have this, then you've actually got a free market system of all kinds of beliefs that can flourish and thrive. And that's not what's healthy for your church.
I want to make sure that we contemplate as we're defining the theology of giving. Some people in your congregation, as soon as you bring clarity, that's all they needed. They're good, whether they were tithing now or not, or if they're participating in offering or not. They just needed clarity. They're in, and so they're fine with it. Some will have a harder time. Some great, godly people struggle with generosity. Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Next Sunday Podcast. I am here with the one, the only, the incredible Jim Shepard.
But I am here with the amazing Frank Beeler. So there you have it.
That's it.
We're now here. We're ready to go.
We made it. Where are we? You said we're here. Where are we?
Did we get a new set?
Different setup here.
No, we came to a new set.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So we are back at the Creator House with Sweetfish Media. And just a quick word about them. They have done an amazing job in helping us. And you and I were here last fall, and we recorded some episodes here, and we loved it so much because we can get away and focus and do episodes here, and it's a great setup. So multi-camera and got everything. So if you have a podcast and you're looking to go to the next level, or if you don't have a podcast and you're looking to get one started, we'd say check out Sweetfish Media.
In sunny Orlando. Yeah. And so take your Next Sunday Podcast to the next level. I see what you did there. Lots of next going on.
I can't get away from it.
Yeah, what's next? We're going to talk about something today.
I'm stoked about this.
I am very excited about it because I feel like you have a ton of wisdom to offer in this area. You have a lot of passion around this as well. And
well,
so I think
let's start with this. Yeah. I have a lot of passion around this. Okay. Let's let others decide how much wisdom is there.
Well, that's why I'm saying it. You're not saying it. I'm saying it. But we're talking about the theology of giving for churches. And we've touched on it in different episodes, how important it is to have that and have a clear understanding of what your church believes and how that's communicated to your congregation, to your staff. You've got to be on the same page. And tell me, as we're getting started, why are you so passionate about this?
Well, it's there's a lot of places I could go, Frank, but it starts with this. A lot of what happens in the church around this conversation, the conversation about faith and money, right? Mm-hmm. And if we go back to what you and I know is what we're trying to accomplish at Generis, especially in the local church, is to change the conversation about faith and money, to move it from transactional to transformational. And what we see is a lot of transactional talk. And what we've decided is a lot of that is because they actually haven't clarified what they believe, which is interesting because they know what they believe about, let's just say, baptism. That's not something that there's a universal position on. Godly people can have different perspectives on that. And it's okay. Through the ages, there have been different positions on that. And it's okay. But your church knows what they believe about baptism, and my church knows what they believe about baptism, even if it's slightly different. Mm-hmm. But the same is not true about giving. And it comes up when I'll ask a pastor, even of a large church, hey, what does your church believe about giving? And they'll tell me what they believe about giving.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, Pastor, let me ask you this. I remember the first time I did this. There were 6 members of his executive team in the room. And I said, Pastor, let's just pass out some cards and let's just do a real quick pop quiz. And let's just do around the table here. What does your church believe about giving? Let's just get everybody to weigh in on this. And he looks at me and he says, why are we doing this? And I was like, I just want to see if everybody's on the same page. And he looks at me and he said, well, I already know we're not. Hello?
Yeah. That's eye-opening.
That's kind of eye-opening. And I'm not going to call them out. We're going to keep the name quiet to protect the guilty. Yeah. But it's a well-known church.
Yeah.
And so and that was an aha for me. And I was like, well, this is what we're talking about. And so as we've been kind of studying at Generis, what are these things that really cause generosity, giving, stewardship to flourish in a local church environment? We decided this is one of the foundational things that you have to clarify that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you've told me that story and given me more details. And one of the things about it is when the pastor said, I already know we're not on the same page, it wasn't because there was an adversarial tension or they had been arguing around it. He knew that they just haven't had the conversation.
Never had the conversation.
There's no way it can be clear because we just haven't talked about it. There's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of other things happening in the church. And so oftentimes, I think when it comes to giving, because there's some room for interpretation that is eliminated based on your denomination or based on kind of the forming of the church around baptism, around communion. It's kind of a short paragraph is the answer more often than not, because you're all from the same path or whatever it may be. Maybe there's more conversation around speaking in tongues or some of the more charismatic things that may come up. There may be different people in the room and they've decided that that's a non-essential, so we don't have to bring clarity around it. In my opinion, when it comes to theology of giving, it's not that they're unwilling to do it and they're not necessarily okay that they haven't had the conversation. It's just not been made a priority, because my understanding is when you and other leaders at Generis have sparked this conversation, the posture is, yes, we need to get this clarified. It's not, well, can we do it without that? It is very convicting that this is something that's important for the congregation and the church to move forward.
Yeah, and it's like this, Frank. It's like you're setting the compass in motion, and you're saying, okay, rather than just kind of going anywhere, let's go here, and this is where we're going to go. So it becomes the foundation for everything that you talk about when the money and faith conversation happens, right? So it's like, I mean, the other thing is, I don't know if you and I have talked about this as much, but it's interesting to me. I mean, and there are certain movements inside the church where they'll say, well, we just believe in preaching the full counsel of God. And what I know that they're generally referencing is they're going to talk about the gifts, all of the gifts. Okay, I get that. But you're talking about all of that and you never talk about money. Well, that's not preaching the full counsel of God.
Right.
Because there's more in the Word on that topic than anything else you would talk about. So you can't say you're preaching the full counsel of God and you haven't talked about money, faith, and possessions in over 3 years. You can't say that, right?
Oh, wow.
And so what this does is it brings it to the forefront as a clarifying conversation, right? And I think this is, if I don't have the scientific evidence, so this is going to be Jim's opinion, okay? I think this is at the root of why the conversation has become so transactional. When you actually don't know what you believe, what do you talk about? How to give. That's all you ever talk about.
Right.
How to give. And these stories we did this amazing youth retreat, which is all good stuff. We want there to be great impact stories and things like that. But if there's never any teaching on what the Bible says about giving, then our people really don't know. And you know, the other thing is, let's just go down this road for a second. This is in not only this area, but lots of other areas, but especially in this area. I sit in churches where they want to call it disobedience. Well, how can it be disobedience if you've never talked about it?
Oh.
If I don't know, that's ignorance. So there is disobedience. Of course, now once you've told me, and if I don't do what I'm supposed to do according to the Bible, now that's disobedience. But if you haven't talked about it in over 3 years, and you've got people who are sitting there who've never heard clear theology about giving in your church and or any messaging about that, that's not disobedience. That's just, I don't know.
Wow. That's so compelling. When it comes to the theology of giving and when church leaders get it right and they spend some time on it, I feel like I've been in enough conversations to hear leaders be a little concerned that now that's going to become too consuming or too much of a priority, because if we put a focused effort on bringing clarity to that somehow our understanding or communicating about money is going to somehow get warped. And so somehow it's going to be perceived that that's the main thing that we're focused on, or we're kind of bent out of shape because we've actually taken some time to focus on it. The same is true with anything else. They're not wrong in wrestling with that, because if we know a senior pastor and their team has been focusing on small groups, they're like, we need to fix our small groups. We know the ripple effect of that is going to be talked about more. It's going to have more impact. It's going to have more presence. There's a little bit of a tendency, I think, when we go, okay, what does it look like for us to focus on giving, really get an understanding here? I think there's a little bit of fear in the back of their mind that somehow it's going to get conveyed the wrong way, that somehow that's too much of a priority for us, or it's going to somehow get lost along the way. So how do you coach a pastor or leader that's wrestling with this, going, hey, I agree, we need to get our theology of giving, we need clarity around this, but I also don't want to be the guy that just all I do is talk about money? So how do you whenever we focus on something, it tends to permeate the other things that we do, our messaging and whatnot. So how can you effectively focus on this, but then manage that tension appropriately?
That's a very real issue, and that's something we need to talk about. So what you know, Frank, is in this conversation, once you do this pivot and you start to make it about theology, initially, maybe even after that, but certainly initially, you're going to draw the skeptics and the cynics out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I see what you're doing there, Pastor. That's smooth, brother. That's smooth. That's smooth. I see what you're doing. And it's happened in churches where I've had the conversation with them and they now start to talk about it that way. They'll get the people who will make those comments. And I just tell them right off the bat, you are going to have to push through the initial cynicism and skepticism that you actually have another motive. And your motive is the motive of Philippians 4:17. What Paul said to the church at Philippi when he was thanking them for the gifts that they had made to his ministry. And he slips this in on us. And he says, and I didn't seek the gift for my own account, but for the increase that came to your account. So the transactional conversation is when I'm seeking the gift for my account. But Paul's saying there was something much bigger at stake here. And what he's saying is, I love, Frank, that you made that gift to my ministry. You know, my tent making was kind of a side gig that I had. I was bivocational and I needed to balance the books, and that was cool that you made a gift and helped me to balance the book. So he's not saying that, you know, there wasn't a gift and it didn't have an impact. It did.
Yeah.
He's just saying that wasn't my motive.
Yeah.
My motive was for you to have this conversation with God and for you to draw closer to God as a result of what you're doing with your giving, which is the real purpose, right? But when we don't talk about this, one of the dangers, Frank, in not talking about this is we have let our people believe, because we haven't talked about it correctly, that the reason they give is to fund our church, which actually pays my salary, which allows you to look at me, oh, Pastor, I know what happens. When I give more, you get more. No, actually, I don't. It's not a commission-based system. I mean, people believe crazy things about what happens in the church. We're not going to go down that one today, but it allows people's thinking to go to a place that's completely out of sync with what the Bible teaches, right? Yeah. And so it makes it harder because every time you talk about it, you're asking for something.
Yeah.
Whether you are or aren't, the agenda, oh, I knew. So your friend who's been out of church for 20 years comes to your church, and the third Sunday in, the pastor says something about money, and he's like, well, I knew that. He's just after my money. It's like, bro, this church is not after your money because God's not after your money. God's after your heart.
Yeah.
And so are we. Well, I just feels like, y'all want the money out of my pocket. Well, look, God doesn't want the money out of your pocket, but he does want the idols out of your heart, and so do we. That's that whole idea that Paul's talking about. I didn't seek the gift for my own account. I sought the gift so that you could have this transformational conversation with God and that you could begin to get it right. Whether it's your first gift or whether it's people like me and you that have been givers for a long time and we're still having revelations about what it means to give, right? God wants to use our money and possessions to transform our lives, not to fund his church.
Yeah.
Let's think about that for a second. He wants to use our money and possessions to transform our lives, not to fund his church. Let's just stop for a minute. First of all, Psalm 24:1 says the earth is the Lord's, and so it's all his anyway.
Right.
And if you if your goal in giving mankind money and possessions was to fund the church, would you put it in mine and your hands?
Right. Find a different way.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
right.
I think you and I are pretty decent on the giving path. We certainly haven't reached a place that we want to reach, but you and I are pretty good on that, right? I wouldn't put it in my hands if that's what I was trying to do. So, and God wouldn't do that. So he had to have another reason for putting money and possessions in our hands. At least one of those is he wants to help us figure out, our relationship with him and to trust him and not trust money, which is the whole idea of no one can trust two masters, right? No one can serve two masters, right? And that's a no one. It's not, well, there's maybe one. No one can serve two masters. You'll hate one and love the other. You'll love one and hate the other. You can't serve both God and, we have to use that word mammon because it's a deistic term. It means money attached to the spiritual forces of this world.
Yeah.
So if we think about that, what it means is money probably has so much power that it might actually be able to draw you away from the altar of the one true God. Well, wouldn't you want to clarify that in your theology so people understand that?
Absolutely.
Because I don't think most lay people know that.
Yeah.
And that would scare you a little bit, wouldn't it?
Yeah. That's so good.
You're thinking money's just this fungible thing in your pocket, which I thought, and that is our relationship with money until we become Christ followers. But when we become Christ followers, money now has another power, that deistic power that Jesus was ascribing when he used the word mammon.
Yeah.
And so we have to clarify theology to get people's thinking correct. You're not doing this to fund our church. That is the effect of what happens when you give, but that's not why you give.
That's so good, Jim. I'm going to go on a little tangent here, and then we're going to get back to theology of giving. Bear with me for a moment. When we talk about giving and we're trying to teach more about it correctly, there's a response required. Well, this past Sunday at my church, my pastor asked me to close out the service. And so he was going to preach the message, and he shared the gospel, and he's like, hey, I want you to wrap this thing up for me this week. And so I get up there, and I was just compelled with this idea of whenever we hear the word of God, it requires a response from us. And we have a response to everything we've heard every single week, every time we read the word, certainly every Sunday at church. When we hear it, we have a choice. Do we do anything with it? Does it change us? Do we take any kind of action? And I think when it comes to giving, the action is so clear that sometimes that makes people uncomfortable, because in many churches, the action that we're trying to guide them to is so unclear that now when we finally are clear, it's in the context of money. And so sometimes I think some people are having a little anxiety because it's like, you're talking about money, you're stepping on my toes. I don't like that. Sometimes it might be, if we look back at our messages, that honestly, when we've been landing the plane with the sermons, we've not been super clear on what we're telling them or guiding them to do, other than kind of reflect on that. And then suddenly when we're talking about money, the call to action is super clear. And so it almost, outside of money, feels a little jarring for their normal experience in your church. And so I think it's just this interesting thing to wrestle with, of like, there may be this other kind of tension going on of not just teaching about money, but money, when we preach on money, we're trying to help them understand what they should do, and there's clear action to it. But sometimes when we're not preaching about money and preaching about other topics, we may or may not have clear action. So then culturally, when you are talking about money, it's not only about money, but it's also, oh, you're asking me to do something right now in a very clear way. So there's a gap. So that can be jarring for some congregations, I think, because the action is so clear.
That's a great observation, Frank. That's a really good observation. I think it has a lot to do with why it's so important to have clarity around this topic. That it's not what the church down the street believes about money or baptism. It's what your church believes about it.
Yeah.
And how you articulate that, and how you're helping people to understand that in a biblical sense. You know, what does the Bible say? In a practical sense, what do you do with that each Sunday when you're here?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what you're drawing attention to there.
That's exactly right.
That.
Yeah. Just having that clarity. The other thing is, there may be some initial pain when you start to talk about this again, as we've talked about. Maybe a couple of people, kind of naysayers, come out, or you get a couple of jabs of people that are a little skeptical or whatever. There may be some of that, but once you build that into the culture, then when you reference it again, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, as it starts to show up in different ways, then you go, no, this is what we believe. This is what we've said. This is what's on the website. And so for a lot of people, it's just that initial shift of, wait, when I go to the giving page at the church, it just tells me functionally how to give and doesn't teach me anything. Now you're shifting that. You're adding teaching. You're explaining it to people, whether you're talking about it on a given Sunday or not, in a big way, or if it's in a smaller way through 3 minutes, or it's a full sermon. Either way, it's consistent with what you've been saying in other places.
Totally.
Oftentimes it's kind of avoided. And so I think there's opportunity there for us to improve.
Well, and to help people, help pastors understand, the pushback is not going to come from your faithful givers. It's going to come from the people who are struggling with this. And that's the very audience that you're trying to reach. So be gentle. don't take offense at it, but don't let it stop you from talking about it, right?
Yeah.
Because those are the very people who you're trying to reach. They don't believe what you're saying. And they've got issues with that. They actually think this is a whole transaction and that there's some, personal agenda you have here, when you don't.
Yeah.
The only agenda you have is Paul's agenda.
Yeah.
I want you to have this relationship with God when it comes to your money and possessions. That's all we're after here.
And I think developing that theology of giving, once you do that as a leadership team or as elders or however you choose to do that, I think the first people to see that and be walked through it and understand that are all of your staff.
Yeah.
Making sure they're clear. They come from different backgrounds, different walks of life. Some people are more comfortable with money than others are. I talked to a family recently at a church. They're both part-time at the church. They don't give at all to the church, at all. And the reason they did is because at some point they did math and said, part of our sacrifice in our income is our gift. And so it's like, oh, well, there's nowhere on this church's website or anywhere where this is addressed or talked about,
right.
or commented on at all. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Do you get to do your math that way? It's just a helpful conversation. And so this becomes a tool to help us guide people, both staff, non-staff, guests in the church, congregants that have been around forever. Yeah. Just some clarity. And clarity is kind.
Yeah. The thing that's fun, Frank, is as we've started to do this with churches, is watching the staff work through this whole theological exercise.
Yeah.
And the ahas and the revelations that become clear for them. Because what they realize is, not only is my church not clear about what it believes about giving, I'm not clear about what I believe about giving.
Yeah.
And so now you begin to get everybody wrestling, and they come together, and this becomes this document, this thing that they can now put before the church and says, this is what we believe, and they all own a piece of it.
Yeah.
That's the fun part, is watching them wrestle with it.
Absolutely. And we're going to include in our newsletter for next Sunday a couple of samples of theology of giving that we hope can help people. And we're not saying you have to believe this way. This is how we've seen a couple of churches do it well for their context and their situation. So certainly want you guys to be able to lean in and use those resources. But let me ask you this. If someone is listening and they know that they don't have a plan for this right now, they need to do this, it feels a little overwhelming. It's like we're going 0 to 60. We don't have anything now, and now we need to have something that's extensive and kind of addresses different areas of giving and understanding of Scripture. Where do they begin? Who needs to be in the room? Where do they start this journey of figuring this out?
Well, for me, I think you start with your executive team in a church, whether you're a smaller church or a super large church. You've got a small group of people, a small cadre of people. If it's a smaller church, there might be some lay people in there as well as staff. If it's a larger church, it might be your executive leadership team. But that would be the group that I would think you'd want to have in the room. Those are going to be the main stakeholders. Now, in a larger church, you're going to want that to go out a little bit further. You're going to build those concentric circles of ownership.
Yeah.
But I would start there and just get into the room. We're glad to help, but this is not an infomercial for our services.
Right.
If you need us to help, we're glad to help you with that. You know where to find us. But you can do this by just getting into a room, and maybe it's not a bad thing. I mean, the pastor didn't want to do that exercise that day because he's like, Jim, I already know we're not. Maybe it's not a bad thing for you just to say, on the front of this card, not an essay, on the front of this card, what do we believe about giving here at our church?
Yeah.
And then begin to struggle with the various views at the table, and then come up with kind of the coalescing of ideas where you actually find something that you can put out there as a church.
That's
it
great.
may happen quickly, Frank. It may take you a little while,
Yeah.
and that's okay. And yours might be, a briefer one. I think we've got an example of a briefer one. We've got an example of a more robust one that actually looks like you're going to seminary by the time you read through the whole thing with Bible verses and everything.
Yeah.
I love it, but their context is they're the kind of church that would want that kind of clarity all the way through. 11 different points.
So I was just about to ask that. So you don't have to do all 11, but if we sat down and said, hey, what do we believe about giving? What about giving? And so there's tithe. What are the elements that they need to bring clarity to? Obviously, one is tithing. What other aspects of giving, whether it be aspects of tithing, like more nuanced elements, of tithing and or offerings and or other stuff, what are we trying to bring clarity to? I mean, we go, the Bible says 10% tithe, done. I think it takes a little bit more clarity than that. So if we were to whiteboard and say, hey guys, what do we believe about? And we had a handful of headings up here that we're trying to make the exercise a little bit more productive. What would be some of those elements?
Well, I think if you're going to articulate giving, you probably need to start with who owns it in the first place.
Great.
Most churches are not going to struggle with that. Mm-hmm. God owns it all. Psalm 24:1, any number of other places. You've got to start there, right? You've got to clarify that there's an owner and there's a manager, and who is who. So God is the owner, and then maybe the second part is to attribute management, stewardship to us. Mm-hmm. And, we've talked about this. I don't think we've actually talked about it on the podcast yet, but this whole idea of stewardship is when you have someone else's property and your responsibility is to manage it in the best interest of the owner. Not just to manage it, but in the best interest of the owner. That's my struggle. I can manage it really well in Jim's interest. Manage it in God's interest is a whole other exercise for me. So start off by clarifying who is God and what's his role here, who is man and what's his role here. The interesting thing, Frank, is when you clarify those two, I've watched a couple of teams struggle with this. When they begin to clarify that, a lot of the other stuff begins to kind of tighten up right under that umbrella.
Got it.
You don't go and find these other things that you might have thought you believe. Look at the larger body of evidence of what does the Bible say. The Old Testament has a lot to say about giving, obviously. One of the things that I love is one of my favorite verses, a couple of verses, is Deuteronomy 14, 22, and 23. Yep. There's 3 topics that are covered in there. The tithe is covered. Yep. Where do you give the tithe? Yep. At the place I'll designate in the presence of the Lord, which is always in the Old Testament, a place of worship. It's either the tabernacle or the temple. The tabernacle is the original mobile church, right?
I see what you did there.
Wah, 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 wah. It was a mobile church. And by the way, if you're getting all upset about set up and take down at your church, they were hauling that thing around on tents and on poles. Okay, so let's just remember that. So it was either the tabernacle or the temple. It was always there. And then he says this, that you might learn to revere the name of the Lord your God always. So the idea of learning to is really the idea of sanctifying. This is a sanctifying exercise that you're not going to reach perfection in this life, but you got to always be striving. Now, the other thing, and again, this tithing thing, that's a great thing for us to address. 2 or 3 ideas on that. First of all, if you're going to use the word tithe in your services, make sure that you have taught clarity around what that really means. Because for a lot of people, the word tithing is synonymous with the word giving. And when you haven't taught them that it's actually a spiritual practice from the Old Testament, then they don't know. So it's not disobedience, it's just ignorance. Right? Back to that. So make sure you use clarity around that. Then, if you're going to use tithing, then you've got to address the idea of where does the tithe go? There are going to be those who believe that the tithe, all of it goes to the local church. There are going to be those who believe that there's some discretion in that. That's not a right or wrong. There's going to be both views. I know that everybody who's got one of the other views is zeroing in on me right now, wanting me to declare. No, I'm not going to declare one right or wrong. They're both valid. They both have their place inside of certain denominational and or theological circles, right? But then to clarify, where does the tithe fit into our giving? In the New Testament, it is very clearly a marker along the way, not a finishing point. Not a finishing point. And so for the person who would say, well, Jim, I'm just not even sure the tithe applies anymore. I believe what Paul believes about giving, on the first day of the week, you save up in proportional. I said, look, you understand, if you're going to buy into what Paul is saying, remember his credentials. He was a Jew of Jews. The one thing you didn't have to tell him about was where to give and how to give and how much to give. He knew that. So when you're talking about his principle, he's got tithing somewhere back in the rearview mirror. He already passed that marker.
That's always
a long
obvious.
Time ago, right? And so provide some clarification for your people on that. What does your church believe about that? And give them the evidence. I think, it's always helpful if you're going to have like 5 or 6 points that you do have some biblical texts that you can cite in there so your people can go to the Bible and find the places where you've anchored your belief. It's not just what you believe. You've anchored it to certain texts in the Scripture, and you can go there and find that.
Jim, that's so good. This has been super helpful. I've literally, during this episode, if you're watching the video, you see me taking notes. I'm wanting to remember things and just continue to learn from you in this area. I love your passion around it. I think this truly will help each church have a game-changing opportunity to improve next Sunday.
Next Sunday.
This is so great.
Next Sunday.
Jim,
or maybe even this Sunday.
Hey, this Sunday. Maybe they jump on it. Depending on when they
Sunday.
listen. Maybe. Who knows? Saturday night. Let's get something
Saturday
going.
night.
There's still time.
Let's do it.
Let's talk again soon.
Let's do it.